Hello, everyone. We're back, joined by the OG host, who's finally found time in his busy schedule. Elliott, you're back with us, or
Hello.
as you call yourself now, E. Uh,
Oh,
you're
well,
tripping like we was on E, as one classic lyric says.
I mean, I
Speaking,
don't know. Is that also on the anyway? Yeah, it's just you gotta give the feds the minimum amount of information is all.
I get it. I get it. I get it. Speaking of E, and speaking of Epiphany, happy Epiphany,
Mm.
everyone.
Or
So
as I prefer to say, Epipahani.
Epiph. Okay, theophany for the Orthodox or the Orthobros. The shining forth of God's light in Christ to the nations, which means you and me, which means heathens like you and me, which means Christ worshiping pagans like you and me. This is referencing, sorry, Elliot, referencing a previous episode I did three episodes ago with Bulge about it might be better. People should check that out. We talked about maybe it might be better to identify as Christ worshiping pagans at this point in history. Um,
Interesting.
in that vein of perhaps trying to be Christ worshiping pagans before we really become Christians, whatever that means. Elliott's here. Was very kind. I've been haranguing him for many a month to talk about his theory of star people. So speaking of magi, and light shining forth and the signs in the heavens and all those things. Elliott is here to tell us about star people, sun people, and moon people. If I understand the schema correctly, correct me if I'm
That's
wrong.
correct.
I
Yep,
am
that's correct.
not. And Elliott informs me that I am a sun people. And
Correct.
I have a diagnosis now. I have something in my hand, but I need to learn more. I need to educate myself about my diagnosis. What does that mean for me as a sun people? And then if hopefully Elliott's gonna do a huge lore dump.
Mhm.
I'm certain he will, and then I can write some sort of like retarded WebMD article about. So you found out you're a sun people. Um,
Yeah, what do
what,
you do?
what does that mean for me? Is there a dietary restriction or yeah? Anyhow, so I guess since I really am not the expert, Elliott is the expert
Mhm.
on this. Elliott, I'm gonna, as awkward as it is, I'm gonna just
Mhm.
pass it to you, and I will opine when necessary. And you teach me, you teach the listeners, and we'll go from there.
No, so I think actually the Magi is a great is just a great way to tee this off because it speaks to the ways in which the ancients interacted with time and timekeeping and where your position was in the temporal framework of reality, right? We have such an enlightenment pilled perspective on time, which is a coordinatized time system, right? Where time begins at Christ's birth as zero, and then there's negative years and positive years. And that's just not really how time used to work, right? Time was literally measured in terms of the movement of the heavens back in the day, right? And would have been measured in terms of the most recent king, perhaps, or number of years since an incredibly important religious event or something like that, right? But the notion of like counting time since the origin of the universe is extremely modern, right? Like as an example, that Genesis isn't meant to give you a chronological notion of how long since the beginning of creation it is. It's just a mythopoetic past, right?
It's a
Yeah.
perhaps a if I a chirodical account, something like that.
Yeah,
Not
versus a
chronological, but
chronos.
yeah,
Yes.
kairos. And I don't know if chirodical is a word, but it is now. So
We're making it a word
yeah,
anymore.
look at me, I'm the captain now. It's a word for this show. Chirodical, yeah.
Every word was made up the first time once. So, okay,
This is
let's
true.
let's
Very
let,
true.
let's let's sort of talk about. So, this whole thought came up where, if we're thinking like very deeply, kind of on a millennia scale, right? What are ways in which it is difficult for societies to reconcile with each other, right? And one of the ways that our culture has been thinking very hard about is the notion of a narrative or a grand narrative or a mythopoetic narrative, right? And does this mythopoetic narrative reconcile with each other, right? Um, And can we find common cause between mythopoetic narratives in a sort of Joseph Campbell situation? And the reason why one would want to find common cause between mythopoetic narratives is that, or mythologies, right, is so that you can, in a technocracy, fit everybody together like little cogs. Because if you can square up everybody's narratives together, you can move them around and interplay them, and basically boil down the structure of society to the smallest possible unit, which is the individual, right? Like separate from family and everything. And of course, I'm an individualist and everything, but the point being is that how do we make the ties, the lateral ties, the horizontal ties between people minimum, and the vertical ties maximum between the state and the person? That's the point of the technocracy, right? So okay, so that being said, I was thinking about it, and actually, one of the things that, regardless of the mythopoetic narratives, that makes it really hard for everybody to genuinely reconcile with each other is the calendar. Because consider this, right? Even for two traditions that are about as close, two or three traditions that are close as they possibly can, right? You have the Jewish, Islam, and Christians, right? Islam being descended from Christianity and
Well,
Judaism.
uh,
I
something
mean,
like that. It
heretically,
definitely,
heretically.
yeah. They all, I mean, all those three faiths count Abraham, right, as like, as they're all Abrahamic, so called. Although I kind of have really questioned that we'll take it, right? We'll vibe with it. That
Well,
the
yeah.
academics tell us that's how it is. They're all Abrahamic faiths, and I question that. But yeah,
Well, there's a notion that that basically everybody who was a heretical Christian who got kicked out of the region wandered down. Not everybody, but there was many people who were heretical Jews and Christians wandered down the Arabian Peninsula, and there was a melting pot there. And this is why the Islam sources have funky, almost Gnostic feeling accounts of the beginning of Christ. But the only reason why I bring up Islam and Judaism and Christianity together is that these three traditions have very deep and close ties to each other relative to a completely different lunar calendar, which is the Asian, right? The kind of Chinese, Japanese, Korean,
yeah,
lunar calendar. And it's one of those things where when you think about it, okay, think of it, and I want you to think about it in an embodied sense, not an abstract sense. You and your family, there is a certain feeling that the year has when you're in school and you're on the academic calendar. And it kind of feels like, if you're in academia feel still, or you're out of academia now, right? Think about if you're in a business or in corporate life, right? The feeling of end of fiscal year, right? That's a very different feeling from the same time, which is the summer, or tax season, right? These are two great things that kids don't have to think about, adults have to think about. Tax season and the end of fiscal year, they happen at the same time in the year, right? That other events do, but it doesn't have the same feeling to you as exams do, right?
right,
So you take that sort of feeling and think about like Thanksgiving versus Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year, right?
yeah.
And how if you are sort of, lack of a better term, white American, right?
No, it's
um
a real term for real
right.
people, by the way.
Right. If you were sort of non-immediately Asian descended, like within one generation or whatever, you probably feel Thanksgiving a lot more strongly than Lunar New Year's. Funny, I was in a Costco the other day, and somebody was saying, "Man, what's the deal with these dragons? Right? Like, why do they have these big dragon alcohol things? Who would ever buy that?" I said, "It's for Lunar New Year," and they're like,
Yeah,
"Oh, that totally makes sense." And that sort of mismatch culturally is like Costco is serving the need of a lunar calendar person, and another person who is on the solar calendar, just on a different a solar/lunar calendar, doesn't even understand it.
yeah,
And those asynchronicities between the two cultures prevents perfectly meshing together. And
right.
so if you are, and we'll break in for some questions here, right? Because there's a lot of stuff, right? But essentially, my proposition is that the Christian calendar is fundamentally a solar calendar.
I would
There's
agree.
deep reasons for that, but we'll go into that.
Yeah,
And that the Jewish calendar and the Islamic calendar both are fundamentally lunar calendars. And there's reasons for the lunar versus solar, in my opinion.
Yep.
There's like esoteric ones, there's like real deal ones, right? But at the end of the day, it kind of feels like Ramadan comes out of nowhere. It's almost like you're listening to music and dancing, and somebody else is dancing, and they clearly are dancing to totally different music. That is how the Jews and Islam and Christians are to each other, and the Christians music has a totally different beat, right? Like 4/4 versus like maybe a waltz, right? Where the
Right.
Jews and the Muslims are they got a waltz going on, we got a 4/4 beat going on. It's like wow, they're just doing a totally different thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'll pause here for a second to
No,
kind
it
of regroup.
makes sense to me, I guess. So
Perfect.
okay, yeah, no, I'm glad I
Yeah.
had understood. We have an ongoing rambling schizo chat, and sometimes I don't know if I'm totally grasping it, but this is what I was picking up from what you were putting down. That yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, historically, Christians are converted. Yes, there was the small contingent of initial believers, initial Christians who are all Jewish, but I mean, it it is it is large by and large converted pagans, right? Or the
Hmm.
offspring
Hmm.
of converted pagans. That and so who probably who might I mean, like if you want to think about in the Roman context, sun is a very important also is a deity, right, in the pre-Christian
Yep.
belief.
Yep.
And so it would make sense that hey, we're bringing the nations to God, really, and to Christ specifically as God's anointed Messiah, King, um, the real imperator, right? The real Caesar, who is Christ, the real one, the for real guy who is also God,
Hmm.
the for real God man. Like you have all your God mans and myths, and then you have your God man and myth who's also real, which is Christ. I mean, this is Tolkien and Lewis talk a lot about this, right? That like Christ is the realized is the realized incarnational God, right? But lots of cultures have this myth. Christ realizes it for us. So it would make sense that in that context, you would also, because as we were talking about, I think before we started recording, grace redeems the world, grace redeems traditions, and grace redeems people and peoples, right? So both individuals and groups. Because salvation is not just an individual thing, although it is, but it is not just that. Sorry, evangelis, that's not how it works. Bring the nations to Christ, things like this. It would make sense that yeah, like it makes sense why the early church just like literally baptized the pagan calendar
Yeah.
in the sense of
Yes.
it's a solar
Yes.
calendar now because the
Yes.
nations are coming to Christ, and at least the nations in the Near East, or at least the maybe not Near East, but like the nation, like the Indo-European dudes, right,
Hmm.
personified by
Hmm.
Greeks and Romans, have a
Yeah.
largely, I mean, it's a solar based system. Now the calendar is not perfect. Obviously, the Romans have
Yes.
done their own
Yes.
tweaks. It's why we have 12 months and not 10. And then obviously there's the Gregorian remix of that. And then now we have leap years and we lose time and gain time. And I mean, then we have our weird daylight savings, which is the hyper modernist cringe version of like we're literally stealing hours and giving them back in some sort of central bank of time. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
but all of that really is downstream from the fact that like yeah, the church quite knowingly baptized and took things from paganism, and this is common pagans take an L. This is, you just keep taking L's, right? Like it's the meme, right? It's the classic pagan tradition, the ancient pagan wisdom of converting to Christianity. It's really what it is. So yeah, I mean, for me, with my proclivities and my historical knowledge and the research interests I have, Elliott, this is
Hmm.
basically to say it's all making sense so far. Um,
No, totally. Well,
hopefully that
and
catches some people in the audience up too, in case they were like, yeah, because again, me and Elliott have this like sort of like we have like this weird like twin language where we have all like shortcuts
it's
for
so
everything, and
true.
sometimes you have to be like,
So
let's
true.
translate this. Yeah,
Well, that's why I gave it a pause, right?
yeah,
And
we appreciate the pause.
so I will address some of what you brought up because it does actually springboard into some of the notes I was
I guess,
making.
can I ask one question?
Yeah, go
Anything
ahead.
I
Feel
brought up,
free.
would you outright disagree with?
No, no, I would
Okay.
agree with everything. I would like I would just slightly drill down on one point, which
Yeah.
is you were pointing out the Julian calendar to Gregorian calendar um update, which by the way, right, is something that divides the East and the West within Christianity, right? Because
Right.
the Eastern Christians use the
Well, did
Gregorian or
you know what I learned
the
recently?
Julian calendar. Go ahead.
You know what I learned recently? Sorry, this is an interruption, but it
Yep,
it
yep, go ahead,
ties.
go ahead.
So
Yep.
Elliott has successfully brought me into the Anglosphere, so I have Elliott really to thank for
Let's
that.
go.
You know what I learned somewhat recently is actually the Anglicans wanted to go do a Stevie Nicks and go their own way. They wanted actually to bridge the two systems and have their
Beautiful.
own third way of doing calendars.
Classic.
But it
Classic.
didn't. Well, but Queen Elizabeth was like, "Really, we're not doing that." I think it was
Yes.
mostly like logistical. But as I recall, it was actually, I believe, I would have to pull that up. I think it was D. I think D actually, John D actually wanted to have his own third way calendar. So
Philosophy. See, D is a star person. D is a star person. We'll get to there.
he's a star person. Yeah. So anyhow, if any of
No,
you
no.
if any of you
But
who are watching this or listening to this have listened to my episode I did with Paz on the Scarlet Thread Society, the Enchanted Office Hours, I think it was from our October episode. We did a whole episode on John D. I didn't get a chance to say that on that episode, so I'm saying it now because we're talking about calendrical systems specifically. But yeah, there was a
Mhm.
group. It wasn't just D. There were actually a group of sort of learned, well, astrologers essentially, who were Anglican.
Astrologers.
Yeah,
Like,
astrologers who were Anglican and were like, yeah, the why don't we just have like an English calendar that kind of what is it that adjusts the calendar but not as much as the Gregorian reform wanted, which is just so standoffish in English, and I love it. It's Anglo separatist in the best of ways, and it didn't win out. So
well,
spoiler.
I think it's interesting, and again, this is all very much on topic, by the way.
Okay, good.
We'll get to the esoteric stuff here in a minute because that'll be a nice punchline. But all of this conversation is really important for continuing to drill down the point, which is that synchronicity, being in sync with each other or out of sync with each other, is literally referring to the temporal beats of reality, right?
Right.
So when we talk about being out of sync, right, like there was a sense in which England at that time was attempting to drag time with it, right? And time and gravity are deeply linked together, right? Like gravity drags time, right?
Right.
And so if you have sufficient mass, you get to define what time is, right? This is why the day begins and ends, as I will continually point out, through London. London is the definition
Yeah.
the origin of time, both in terms of the day and in terms of the year, right?
Yeah.
Like it is not France. France tried to so this is where God reigns, so to speak, right? Because D wanted to base, probably I bet D and friends were like, oh, let's take an astral approach. I'm sure they didn't, like, it
Actually,
wasn't
no.
literally sidereal, but
The D thing was actually that he wanted to have the Gregorian reform more accurately account for the birth of Christ.
yes, yes.
And it wasn't just D, by the way. This was multiple people. I believe D was part of them. I don't totally quote me on that. If it wasn't, I'm certain D was talking to these people. It was people in and around D were like,
Mhm,
hey, the idea of a reform we agree with. So that's also
mhm.
kind of Anglican, but
Yeah, it's
let's
kind of
not
a
go
reform,
so
yeah.
far. Let's kind of do it like our own way. That's also incredibly Anglican, right? Like of like this, hey, we're reformed, but in our way. Um, kind of
And
middle ground via Medea. So yeah.
my understanding, and this is not a perfect correlation, obviously, but if you're familiar, this is all kind of very deep stuff. But again, or in the weeds type of stuff. But if you're familiar with sedevacantists in the Catholic situation, the Orthodox have a similar kind of hyper Orthodox sedevacantist type people, ultra Orthodox, and they are called old calendarists because I guess the Orthodox made an update to their Julian calendar for whatever reason. I'm sure it has to do with the calculation of Easter because it always has to do with the calculation of Easter, right? And the
Yeah.
old calendarists are like, no, we need to use the exact same calendar that has always been used, and they're very small and all these things. But calendars fundamentally divide people. Oh, go ahead.
You talking about old believers?
Could be, could be. I just heard it from the ortho bro that I know that they're called old calendarists.
Yeah,
So
I
I
think
don't
that
know.
those are different from old believers. Old believers had a more extensive gripes with what was going on, I believe, in
Oh,
Russia. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sure old calendarists also have extensive gripes, but
They
that's
have
kind of the,
extensive gripes, I believe.
you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, I would
yeah, yeah.
imagine. Yeah.
I mean, just like sedevacantists are not like, there's a lot that goes into that. You know what I mean? It's not literally just, oh, we think technically speaking the seat is empty. There's usually other gripes that the sedevacantists have, right? So
Right.
anyway, but point being, okay. So let's think for a second, because again, I want to. It's not even a correction. I just want to drill down on an interesting point, right? Which is that, hey, in the Julian calendar, the reason why we updated the Gregorian calendar is because there's this notion that the Julian calendar was kind of inaccurate, right? But what does it mean for the calendar to be inaccurate? Well, okay, so here's the thing, right? And this gets into kind of the technical details, which are also the esoteric details in this case, right? So there are two real parts of timekeeping in on this earth, right? There is the Earth Day, which is the time it takes for the Earth to make one revolution around its axis, and from our perspective, that's sun up to sundown, right? Or sun up to sun up again,
Right.
so to
Yeah.
speak, right? So that's one full day. That is real. And then there is the time it takes for the Earth to go around the sun, right? So one full, not rotation, but one full, circle
Orbit.
around
Yeah.
the sun orbit. Yes, precisely, right? So these two things are completely real. What are human imposed? So that's to say, the real thing is that there are 365 days
Give
in
or give or
one
take.
year, give or take,
Give or
right?
take. Yeah.
Because it's not perfect, right? Like
Right.
the rotation of the Earth does not have anything like physically to do with the sun. So, this imperfection is why we have a problem, because it does not take 365 full days. It takes 365 and a little bit. That a little bit, if you just go with 365 days in a year, starts to add up. And all of a sudden, what happens is this isn't an issue for the first several years, but essentially your calendar tracking of 365 days in one year starts to get out of sync with the seasons. So if you think about our current calendar, if we did not have leap years at all, right? So this is where the leap day comes from. If we didn't have that quote unquote correction day over like honestly, not very many years, all of a sudden July would be when winter happens, right?
Right.
And what is the point of a calendar? And this is where it gets spicy. The point of a calendar for a sun people is to track the dying and rising of the sun, so to speak, right? Like
Yeah.
that is to say, like the winter, the summer months. When do you sow your crop? When do you
Right.
harvest? Like that is the reason why you care about tracking time. But what if you're not a farmer? What if you're a nomadic people who, frankly, mostly uh, navigate during the night, which is what most Arabs did for the
Yeah.
longest time, right? Merchants moving
Desert
around.
dwelling people. Yeah.
Yep. They're not necessarily tied to a specific plot of land. Obviously, many Arabs were, right? But it's less important because who cares if you can't? I'm talking particularly Saudis, right? Like
Right.
that kind of Arabian Peninsula Arabs, not Mesopotamians. It
Yeah.
was sometimes incorrectly called Arabs, right?
Right.
But okay. So and same thing for Jews, right? The Jews have a large nomadic history. They
Yeah.
also have a more static history, but nomadicism, a sort of a spatiality, right,
Yeah.
is sort
Well,
of
and
baked into the Jews. Go
if
ahead.
I
Yeah.
may, like in the Old Testament,
Yes.
where do like a lot of the well, and the New Testament, by the way, voices crying in
Yes.
the wilderness. I mean, this is sort of that's the herder prophet motif that you see
Correct.
a lot of, like, you know, rarely, not all, well, I don't want to say rarely, but like the voice of God is strongest outside, like in the wilderness, and it's the people who brave the wilderness, herders usually, who hear, are more apt to hear the voice of God, and that kind of whole, obviously this is that motif keeps recycling in different ways throughout the Old and New Testaments. Like I say, I mean, it's not like it just stops. And I mean, if you want to think about the continuation in Christian tradition, I mean, I would contend this continues in the monastic tradition, right? Of like the going outside, like going into the desert fathers, for example, to give the orthobros a hat tip, right? Like we'll go into the desert to flee the world because the desert has nothing. And so that's where we can hear God the loudest, something like that. So yeah, I mean, all of that kind of, I hear what you're saying. I'm picking up what you're putting down. I'm just adding flavor text to it. Continue.
No, absolutely, and that's all very correct flavor text, right? So, if we start from this point, there is a pretty strong correlation, not a perfect correlation, between cultures who are north or south, right? But mostly north, who deal not with an eternal present, but with seasons. So the
Yeah.
seasonal people tend to be sun people because the sun is constantly dying and rising for them. And I mean
Right.
that very, like, technically speaking, like in terms of like in many of these cultures, it is way more important that the sun dies and that your main god is a dying and rising god in these more northern climates, whereas more equatorial climates, you still find this, but it's more eternal based. It's less immediate, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know. I can think of exceptions to that, but yeah, you
Well,
know.
so what one key exception that a lot of people will know off the top of their head is Osiris, right?
Yeah,
But but Egypt is interesting because they're equatorial, but also farmers, right? So
true.
there's a sense in which in that pantheon, the moon, the goddess, right, who's a sort of a moon, darkness, night goddess, and Osiris, right? Obviously Osiris is on top, right? But there's a more important part. Isis actually puts him back together. She plays an important part of resurrecting him, and this is where the sun and the moon come together, right?
Right.
So you could almost call it out. So anyway, in the Jewish sense, when they're herders, right, largely nomadic people.
Pastoralist, I believe, is the fancy term. Yeah,
Got it.
pastoralist. Yeah.
Pastoralists, right?
Yeah.
And a little bit of farming, a little
And
bit of
some
olive
farming.
trees
Yeah.
here and there,
Yeah.
but it's not like you're not like, going out and farming. That's not your whole gig,
Right.
right? You're going to be more focused on the lunar calendar. And why? Well, because you are way more focused on birth and death, right? Like
Yeah.
birth and death almost certainly. So in the West, right now, there's a pretty strong correlation between certain times of year and births, right? Because there's a kind of natural season to knock somebody up on the solar calendar, right? Whereas
you heard it.
whereas if
You heard it here, folks. You heard it here.
right, like spring everybody's excited, right? In fall everybody's excited, right? but
Right.
but winter they're hunkered down, and summer they're hunkered down, right? And yes, people will happen, but if the seasons are not a thing, if they're not relevant for you, you live in a kind of eternal year, and hence the lunar calendar, the moon, is way more important for you for many reasons. Partly because of the woman's cycle, but also
Yep.
because the sun is not changing. It is a constant all the time. It's going up and down every day. So
Yeah.
all right, so all that groundwork being said, essentially the esoteric angle here is to consider that the day is the shortest wavelength that we're talking about, and that actually maps to the man's hormonal cycle. Men tend to have a hormonal cycle that's 24 hours roughly. The month, right, is the second shortest wavelength, right, which is the correlates to the woman's hormonal cycle, right, roughly 30 days, but really four kind of phases of the hormonal cycle, which is roughly 10 days each,
Right.
total cycle, right? And so that gets about 40-ish, 30-ish days, depending, right? And then the year is a longer wavelength, 365 days, 52 weeks, right? And then the sidereal year, which is the year counted not as it takes for the earth to go around the sun, because you can think about it like, think about the center point of the earth, right? Going from kind of one point around the sun back to that same angular point around the sun, right? So it makes one full orbit around the sun. But the sidereal year is when the picture of the sky matches the picture of the sky again,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So that also incorporates the rotation of the Earth too. So it's slightly longer by like a little bit, right?
Right.
Because again, the Earth's rotation and the Earth's orbit don't really sync up perfectly, and so anyway, the point being is that there's a little bit of extra time between when the Earth hits the sun point, right, and when the Earth like actually is looking at that same sky picture again. And there's wobble and blah blah blah. There's all sorts of complicated stuff, but the sidereal is slightly longer, and it's much longer for sort of mythopoetic reasons. But like literally, that's the case, right? So essentially. What we have is we have four different types of people as far as I can see, right? There's Earth people, right, who are focused on Earth based time stuff, right? There are day people, right? Or sun people, right? And then there
Could you
are
even call them Damon?
well, I mean, if you want to be a Damon, sure. But you're
Ah.
um, and then there's those sort of like so you got the Earth people, the Sun people, the Moon people, and the Star people, right? Those are the four different types of people. The Earth people, they're focused like you can think about like your Wiccan pagan types. You know,
Yeah.
they might account for all the other stuff, but they're way more focused on like just tracking what is happening on the earth right here right now. So you can think about, this is a reason why a lot of these people, their vibe is kind of the Pacific Northwest Indians, right? You don't really hear about a calendar system with these guys. I'm sure that they had some sort of
I mean,
calendar, right?
seasonal awareness was definitely there because they didn't farm, because they had such a plethora and wealth of naturally occurring food sources. But
Yep.
obviously, I
And
mean,
they would
there's
move like
seasonal variations in those for sure.
100%, right? They'd
Yeah.
move from place to place, but and I could be completely ignorant here, so I'd be welcome to correction here. And again, this isn't a diss or anything. It's just like, dude, if you don't really need a calendar system, you don't need a calendar system, my guy. You know what I mean? Like
I mean,
calendars for tracking.
yeah, I'm not an expert in the calendrical understanding or the year, like the seasonal understanding in Pacific Northwest Native American groups. But I mean, there is a fair amount of daylight shift up here throughout the year because we're relatively far north, relatively
For
speaking.
sure, for
Not
sure.
everyone can be Alaskan, but I mean, we're relatively far north, and you do get, I mean, like the summers are, you have much longer days than in like actual daylight time, right? There's a huge amount of shift, I think.
Yep,
So
yep.
I would imagine that it's there, but I don't, I'm not an expert on that, so I can't speak like as an expert on that.
But I would imagine,
Yeah.
and this is where there's like maybe a connection between the star people and the earth people, right? Is a lot of earth people I talk to that I would classify as an earth person, they tend to focus entirely on the equinoxes, right? Which is kind of the pure objective, this is happening then. So if you don't have to care about like, okay, God has ordained that on this calendar month a yearly feast happens. If you're just like, hey man, 7 days before the equinox, this event happens. If that's how your trigger goes, then you're an Earth person, in my opinion, right? You could
Okay.
also be a star person, but you're very likely an Earth person in my mind. If you are measuring it in terms of just the objective factors of reality and not putting names to those factors, if that
Okay.
makes
Yeah.
sense,
Makes sense.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
'cause you're not operating off a coordinate system. Both Earth and star people don't really have a coordinate system that they care about. They might
Okay.
use them, but they don't care about them.
Okay.
Whereas sun and moon people have an explicit coordinate system that they care about, right? Because they're actually measuring the time, right? Like that, it's important that certain things happen relative to each other within the chronological calendar, and we sort of don't care how they map up to the seasons. And so the
Right.
perfect example of this with Christianity is Easter,
Yeah.
right?
Movable
Easter is,
feasts.
yep, movable feasts, right? Movable feasts are the anchoring of the solar calendar to the actual like external world, which is why they're hard to calculate
Well,
because
and also, I mean, in the case of Easter, it's also relating to back to Passover. So it's like the
yes.
explicit and purposeful lunar cohabiting inside the solar, because it's that because cf what I said earlier about
Hmm.
like Christian or converted pagans, right? Like it's like like we're going to use the pagan solar system, but we're going for the most important feast of the year. We are going to explicitly we're not gonna change how that's. I mean, we're going to. Well, it depends. Obviously, you get the contentions as we've already said about how you calculate Easter, but it
Yep.
moves around because it's actually not a solar holiday. It's tied. It's its own holiday. It's not Jewish. It's very Christian, but it's tied back into a more lunar understanding of time, because of it being in and around surrounding Passover, basically. That's right, like because of the date of and time period of crucifixion. So and resurrection. So that's like it bridges the two, right? So Easter is
Yes.
very liminal by
Yes.
by definition, right? And this is also
Correct.
like clearly done on purpose, right? It's not like this is clearly done on purpose to it's a bridging of heaven and earth. It's a bridging of the pagan and the Jewish to kind of make the Christian, if I might be so bold.
And
That might
it's a
that will the people that statement will offend. I want to offend, so go harder. That is on purpose and is a good thing. Um,
so
all
so
your
so
stuff, all your good stuff is belong to us, right? All your good stuff, pagans, is belong to us, and all your good stuff, Jews, is also belong to us. So we merged the two. Um,
and the reason why aliens would come visit Earth, right? I was listening to some scientists on this point, right? Is to view the natural phenomena of the solar eclipse because there's no reason why this happens. There's not like, oh, yeah, if Earth is in the Goldilocks zone, which is basically given a star where the habitable part of life is, then you'll have a moon that would solar. It's like, no, Earth's moon being the size it is, at the distance from the sun it is just perfect enough to produce not completely covers of the sun because that'd be less interesting. The perfect cover of just the sunlight, so you can see the corona around it. Right, like
right.
that phenomena is really friggin' weird, and humans picked up on it, which some science people think is why maybe we became religious. Right, they're thinking maybe we would have been science people if it weren't for eclipses, which then really kind of gives, in my mind, a little bit of an actually good in my mind, um, reason for, hey, man, if we as human beings are God's chosen people, he put us here on earth with eclipses to get our attention.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, if I can make a book recommendation to you and anyone
Go
listening,
ahead, feel free.
Martin Buber, who was an Austrian Jewish philosopher, started his career, I believe, in Vienna and ended it in Tel Aviv, I believe. No, Jerusalem, University of Jerusalem, for
Mm.
obvious reasons. Mid-centuriness happened.
Yes, of course.
He still wrote in German though. He refused to stop writing in German because it was the language of philosophy
Beautiful.
for him. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the end, he was still Austrian, right?
Yeah.
So he wrote this book, Gottesfinsternis, in German, and it's The Eclipse of God. And there's many English translations. The Eclipse of God by Martin Buber gets kind of, actually, I think, Elliott, you would particularly enjoy that book if you haven't read it. It gets all into this, like, philosophical, but also, I mean, it dabbles kind of in a woo sense of like, what do eclipses mean for
Mhm,
humans? And
mhm,
like,
mhm.
what do they mean about God? So yeah, yeah, no, I
Yeah,
mean,
and, and
the
and
eclipse of the eclipse of a total eclipse of the heart. I don't know. Like, it's just like what happens. Like,
well,
you feel like the world's ending when that happens, and the
and I don't
animals go
know.
crazy, and the birds fly around, and everyone's like losing their minds.
And I don't know how you would think about this, Colin, but there is speculation amongst some biblical scholars that, in part, the Jacob Esau story is the story of a solar eclipse because
Hmm.
Jacob has no hair. He is the younger brother, right? Esau is the older brother who's very hairy. And what does he do to steal the birthright that the mother, right, is setting up to subvert the father? Right? It all
Interesting.
lines
Yeah.
up beautifully, right? Is that he puts on wool to
Well, yeah.
to to trick the blind father into thinking that he's Esau, and the speculation from, again, some scholars is that this is mirroring the moon putting on the corona of the sun because the moon grows hair all of a sudden for a
Interesting.
brief minute, you know?
I need to read up on that. That sounds fascinating. I mean, my initial gut take is, yeah, I don't think that contradicts. I think it actually just makes that story all the stronger,
Yes.
like
Well,
mythopoetically and
yes.
theologically. Like it also would, assuming that's true, and it feels true, but I mean, assuming that is
Yeah.
actually like a cogent thing, I need to read up on it. I would think it would
Yeah. Yeah.
also just it well, I know why you're bringing it up. It further kind of
Yes.
solidifies uh, the argument here that the Jewish calendar is obviously a lunar calendar and moon people, right? Like that this is a moon culture wrote that story,
Yes,
right?
moon
Yeah,
cultures tend to be very excited about eclipses, right?
yeah,
But here's the reason why I brought this up in this context, right? Is because you were pointing out that Easter is meant to replace Pascha, right? And so in a divine subversion of the trope, the sun is eclipsing the moon in this
yeah.
case, right? And that's what Easter is doing, right?
Well,
Is
and
that it
and and
is
and, and Christ is the Son of Righteousness.
exactly.
He's the SON of God, but he's also the SUN of righteousness.
He
So
is the light and the way,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like
Yeah,
this is why, since we are Christ centered in the West, we are a sun people, and this really gets to the real insight that I was having, which is that um, it is potentially possible for how do sun people and moon people cohabitate in with each other, right? They have different ways of, at least historically speaking, it seems, of dealing with each other. Sun versus so think about two sun cultures, right? Like Christianity versus Rome. One of those is going to win, right? They will fight until one is victorious, and then they'll just merge, right? What about with two moon people? Well, two moon people don't have to be in conflict nearly as much at all, right? Because they're both like, they're going to be different lunar calendars, but they're still lunar. You know what I mean? There's no cosmic face off between the two. It's just you do your thing, I do my thing, right? I might tax you a little bit, I might kick you out of my land, but the fights are a little bit, they're hostile, obviously, and they're brutal still, but they have less, I think, cosmic significance. Right, and maybe this is just bias because I'm Christian sphere, right? But okay, so how did the sun people inhabit the moon people land? Like, okay, the Christians under like who are under historically speaking, I'm talking like ancient times where people are actually deeply connected to their traditions, right?
right.
Um, you know, they kind of chafe at the bit. You know what I mean? They are not happy to live under, even if when the moon people are kind of chill, there's like lots of groups of Christian people that are not happy to live under the moon people. You know what I mean? They're just not
Right.
doing it. They'll overthrow and, crusade and all that stuff. And of course,
Yeah.
people crusade it anyway, right? Like that's just a human thing.
Right.
War is always going to happen, but like again, what's the cosmic significance of it, right? And again, I might just be ignorant of the other two traditions, but I do think that now, what about with sun people, with moon people hanging out, right? It seems to me that the sun people don't quite realize that when moon people roll in, you know, uh, if you try to make it co-equal, there's going to be an eclipse, right? So it's possible for the moon people like to be subordinate to the sun people, but you can't have equal footing in
Yeah.
that society. And I'm not necessarily making an anti sort of individual rights egalitarian argument. It's just like look at how the myths are not squaring between, you know, yeah, go
Right. You're
ahead.
looking at cultural incompatibilities, or at least exploring potential cultural incompatibilities.
Because consider like your friends that are on Ramadan, right? They just kind of come out of nowhere all the time, right? So you'll be working along,
You
doing
got
your
friends on
thing.
Ramadan?
Oh, I used to back when I
But
worked retail. Yeah, well, I mean, they were. Well, in fact, they were Bosnian descendants, so
Bosnian, yeah. Well, so they're yeah
Bosnian
they
Herzegovinian, right? So
they
they
had to
were like
stop
white.
drinking vodka for Ramadan as if they're Bosnians. Yeah.
They were like white redhead who was starving herself during the day because it was like, what? Oh, you're actually Muslim. That's wild. Like, that's how that works.
The Ottomans were unfortunately very much a thing, but yeah,
Exactly. Nobody likes the Ottomans, I
nobody
think.
likes them.
not
Very,
even the
very nasty. These atoms are nasty.
um and so you can kind of see, like, again, I don't know how much of this is actually true, but poetically speaking, what I'm saying here is that there's a sense in which, like, the sun people outshine the moon people in,
Oh, for sure,
in a given society, and
for sure.
so the sun people are going to actively try to take it over. Right, and if the sun people cede the sun people society to the moon people, they'll get eclipsed and they'll be
Yeah,
kind of confused about why everything's going haywire all of a sudden. The moon people are going to be that disturbed because, again, they're not really in the dying and rising framework nearly as much, right? So
right.
they got less big emotional swings, cosmically speaking. This is on the cosmic level. This isn't like personal or cultural or whatever level, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's case by case, obviously. So okay, so what are we saying here? We're saying that the solar is masculine, the pillar of mercy, if you're going to be super esoteric, right? The bright one. And that the lunar is feminine, the pillar of severity, right? Which is kind of the feminine one. And so, okay, so who are the star people then, right? Because
yeah.
you've said a whole
Because you've
bunch.
been told that. Well, that was my next question, is because you keep saying that you are a star people, and I'm like, well, what is a star people? Like,
Yes. And so, with the Earth people, who are focused entirely on not coordinatizing the seasons or the days or the months or whatever, they're like, hey, sun up to sundown, right? Like,
right,
if you think about your, like, just regular pagans, right?
right.
They're not saying on the third day of the month. They may, but that's stolen or borrowed from a
Yeah,
previous society, right?
yes,
They're much more likely to say Thor's Day in the sense that that is the day of Thor.
right.
It's not that we needed to come up with a day, and so, yeah, we're gonna name this after Augustus this month. It's like, no, 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 this is Thor's Day because that is
Well, and
you know
honestly, the Germanic tribes who had the Thor's Day just took that from the Romans, though, dude. So like
yeah, there you go.
the
Okay, see,
naming
see,
functions
see,
was just
yeah.
copied from the Romans,
See,
actually.
okay, see, freaking crushed it. I'm so good at this. Like, I predicted exactly what I was saying, which is to
Yeah,
say that, like, like the whole notion of coordinatizing the system is foreign to, like, just normal pagan types. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Because,
yeah,
like, when you're a Viking raider, does it matter whether it's Sunday or not? It does not. You're just, today we are going out raiding. We're gonna raid until we get tired, and then we go home when it's winter, right? It starts to get a little bit cold. We're out of here. Bye. Right.
right.
Uh, like, it's a very, like, it's a very what we would think about as atemporal, but it's really a coordinatized temporal, where, yeah, they respond to the season, but they respond to the season. They don't anticipate the seasons. That's the whole
Yeah,
point of a calendar, is to anticipate the seasons. So
right.
Earth people, right? They're kind of receiving the time. A star person is kind of preceding the time, right? That is to say, they're not time independent in the sense of we're reacting to time. They are time independent, and they are proacting to the time, above and beyond even the star, the sun and the moon people, because sun and the moon people are purely cyclical, right? So they are responding to the seasons and to the moon cycles, right? So either to the hormonal cycle of the woman or the kind of hormonal cycle of the earth, right? Or of the sun, but, like, not about, like, specific time and events in this time and place. And this is where the planets and the house system and all of these things get into play, because in astrological terms, you're looking at the stars and the planets and how they move relative to each other, and sort of create, this is the least woo way I can say this, create patterns in the sky that tell you stuff about what the heavens are doing, right? Because the heavens are interacting sort of somewhat independently, or actually fully independently, of the sun and the moon and the day night cycle, right? They're doing their own thing, which is why, the in ancient times, the quote unquote gods, right? Or in our times, the ancient angels, maybe, or the planets, or whatever, God's scooting the planets along, are telling us about what's going to happen, coming up, because those heavenly factors are what are kind of interacting with the earth. So you can think about the seasons, and okay, every day in your routine, you get up, you take a shower, you make breakfast, right? That happens more or less every day. But then there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens differently from your day, and that affects tomorrow, that affects other people's tomorrow, blah blah.
Right.
And so it is similar to the astrology. The astrologer isn't focused on the what time do you have breakfast. They're focused on the okay, if you stub your toe, right? Like what's going to happen after that type of questions, right? And so unique events in time and space that are outside the cyclical time and outside of the kind of natural time, that's what the astrologer is focused on. They're focused on like in the span of eternity, what are unique events that are going to happen in particular times and places? And I'm not saying I'm like necessarily an astrologer per se, but when I say that I'm a star people, I am focused on the perennial cosmic events that are like when you're like, why do I care that we're in the age of Aquarius, right? The Christian doesn't care. The I guess the everyday Christian doesn't care, the everyday Muslim doesn't care, but the prophet cares because the prophet in the kind of Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king, and that kind of configuration, I reckon that sun people are king people, and
Yep.
that moon people are high priest people, and that star people are prophet people, fundamentally based, right? And so the king is deciding what's going to happen today, right? The prophet, the high priest is deciding what happens this month, and the prophet is deciding the exception to either of those rules, right? Like, hey, we need to go in a different direction, or you guys are corrupt. Like they are the kind of cybernetic second layer on top of the system, not saying, hey, it's this time, and honey, it's 4 o'clock, time for your insert meme time, right? Like the
Yeah.
prophet is like, no, that rule is ridiculous. We can't do that rule right now because extraneous reason. And
Right.
that is why the so it's kind of interesting, right? Because you have how does each type of person learn about the coming of Christ, right?
Right.
There were prophecies that are saying, "Hey, it's going to happen at this basically around this time of year," and it's like it's going to happen in this month. And then there was signs that the Magi saw in the stars that said, "Hey, it's going to happen soon, and it's going to happen over here." And the stars are telling us that, and that is the star that the Magi followed to Christ, right? Took them a couple of years to get
Right.
there because it's
Yeah.
sort of far away. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So that being said, like, it's funny because anybody who wants to really bring up the Magi has a little bit of an Enlightenment tension, right? Because you can't say that the Magi it's similar to saying, oh, if you're talking to angels, you're talking to demons. That's obviously false and absolutely anti-biblical, not even unbiblical, anti-biblical, because people talk to angels all the time. People get
Right.
visions from people all the time. This is
Right.
a completely reasonable way that God talks to us. And if you believe that he doesn't, you are enlightenment pilled and you should be ashamed of yourself.
Amen.
Similarly, right? I am not saying that in particular our version of astrology is correct. However, what I am saying is that reading the signs, air quotes, in the stars is a completely valid way by which God talks to his people, right? And the Magi are a perfect example, but not just the Magi. There's plenty of other people who are reading the skies, or reading dreams, or visions, or interpreting, or whatever,
Philip
right?
Melanchthon, one of the more and one of the more well-known Lutheran theologians.
Hmm.
And I think, as I've said before here, or perhaps it was on Scarlet Thread Society, but it
Mm,
bears
mm,
repeating that Melanchthon in some ways gives more shape to modern Protestantism than Luther does, even
yes.
because Melanchthon was systematized it and scholasticized it, and was also reading signs in the sky. So I mean, people have to. I mean, and maybe the tradcast will be like, this proves that Protestantism is evil, but I'm like, well, I don't know, because you got all these medieval monks doing something kind of similar, and maybe some of them were outright heretics, even according to the Roman Church, but I don't know, like some of them are like, you'd be surprised at the stuff that you find like as comments, side comments in writers even such as like big name dudes from the Middle Ages. You'll find these comments, you're like, oh, they're they're not astrologers per se, but they're clearly operating in a world wherein like signs mean something, right? Like if something
Yes.
happens and something changes that you can see, that must mean something. And that is, I think, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily star people, if I've understood your system correctly, but it means they're
But
operating
they
in
are
a
star
system.
respecters.
They're star respectors, and they're
Yeah.
operating in a system where stars do matter, right? Like,
Yes.
yeah,
And this is kind of the challenge, right? And the reason why I keep operating on the Enlightenment is really important for this one, which is to say that again, all of these systems had appropriate had appropriate ways of engaging. So like when I say lunar calendar, I double checked on the Wikipedia page just to make sure I wasn't totally out to lunch on this, and this is true, right? That they're not actually called lunar calendars proper. Every solar calendar has a lunar element. Every lunar calendar has a solar element. They're not perfectly
right,
like solar or lunar because you got to track both at the end of the day. Even if you're like in the equator, the seasons do kind of matter at the end of the day, right?
yeah, right,
But thing is that because hey, the seasons affect the stars, and see that is the connection, right? The
right.
stars are fundamentally also seasonal, so the sidereal calendar, solar and lunar, they all work together, right? To help you understand what's going on. And
So would you
with
say,
the Enlightenment, we enlighten ourselves with our own personal light, aka electricity,
yeah,
that drowns out the skies. And so we think the stars aren't there and can't affect us, but they still do. They are there. And again, Western astrology has also been kind of enlightenment pilled in that it's been so systematized.
right,
However, like the reason why I bring the Esau Jacob notion up is that this would have been completely obvious to anybody who was even a midwit back at that
yeah,
time. It
right,
would have just been like, oh, duh, like that's what all that stuff means because the symbols mean stuff.
right,
The reason why I rail against the Enlightenment is that we have forgotten, including even the Catholics, what our own symbols mean. And
right.
our reductionist notion has caused us to look only at the earthly presence and not at the heavenly presence. And that is the reason why I'm a star people, because I am focused on ignoring the earthly stuff because we already got that covered now. Like we need more star stuff in the Christian tradition that's kind of looking up at the heavens and down from the heavens from that perspective because we are over indexed on the earthly kind
Yeah.
of matters, you see. So
No, that
anyhow.
makes sense. That makes sense. It takes all kinds.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah. No, thank you for that. That, I mean, that I'm glad that I had understood it more or less correctly from our text exchange. So that's happy for me. I hope other people who are hopefully watching this also it changes the way either you think or maybe just confirms some things, inclinations or intuitions you had. If I could ask one just like a test
Yeah,
question
feel
example, or
free.
just a,
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
would an example of a star culture be like Polynesians who navigated quite extensively by star movements?
Probably. I mean, because when you think about it, um, Polynesians don't even have to. Okay, so here's the thing. So, firstly, Polynesians are not. Um, they are not. Uh, I don't know how to say this sort of correctly. They're not food technology people. I'll say it like that,
Yeah.
right? We tend to be a little bit snobbish, right, in the West, but like they don't farm. I mean, they do
There is
farm,
no
but they
there. Well,
kind of don't.
there's some farming actually. I mean, there's like taro farming and things like that because there were farming techniques that they brought from. So Polynesian languages originate from what is now Taiwan,
Hmm.
Formosa, and so
Hmm.
I mean, clearly they were bringing domesticated animals and certain farming techniques and technologies with them. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but obviously, the one thing they have is a lot of water, and the one thing they don't have is a lot of land. So you're going to have to. I mean, that
Yeah.
will affect your yeah. You're not going to have a hyper focus on agriculture. Although there's some like there's low level agriculture stuff.
Eh,
Um,
yeah, and there's some like
and there's also
no, for sure.
aquaculture. I mean, there's aquaculture stuff
Yes.
in Poland. There's where
Yes.
you're kind of farming the sea in a way, which is different. Yeah.
And so, getting back to your question, right? Your original question, which is like, hey, man, just to check my intuition, are Polynesian star people, to a certain degree, I'm not really, I'm not really the correct person to answer
Too
this
much of a
in the
howley.
sense that,
Too much of a howley
right?
boy.
Exactly, right. Like I don't really know the Polynesians 100% and stuff, but I get this sense, and it's just tough. But yes, like I think that, like, so for instance, I think that uh it seems to me that like people who are focused more on navigating really far distances tend to be more attuned to the stars, right? So this is why like the Muslims, right, and the Greeks and Romans all were very, this is why I reckon actually that the Greeks and Romans kind of maintained a pantheon for a long time, right? Because the stars put, had a big impact on them for a very, very long time until finally the sun rose, right? And it kind of blotted out all the stars, right? I would be curious, like the research question that I would have to kind of like verify or confirm that this is more mythopoetic than real, would be, how did the Vikings navigate? You know what I mean? Did they use the stars?
Largely not so much, largely from landmarks, and then things like sea swells and bird like looking at how
Migratory
seabirds, yeah,
patterns.
yeah, and like but also like paying attention to currents.
See, because
Yeah,
this is exactly in line with my prediction of Vikings are Earth people. So they do not care about the stars, right? Because they don't have to go long
but
distances. Precisely.
but Norse mythology is chock full of cosmological things. Skull and Hati are the wolves chasing the sun and the moon, and that's how
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
explain eclipses and stuff like that. So
Hmm. Hmm.
does that problematize your system, or I'm just stress testing your ideas here?
Yeah, no, 100%. Well, yeah, and again, and this is a total cop out. All of the science brain people are going to completely just explode. But I'm like, well, that's where it's mythopoetic. but but
Okay,
but
yeah,
but to the point being is that actually, no, seriously, again, this is, for the science brains, this is all about sliding scales on all four of the Earth, stars, moon, sun, right? It's just like, hey, which do you care about first? What's your primary? Is it 50-50, is it 25-25-25, right? Like, what's the thing? My prediction with the Polynesians, to get back to that question, is it's probably closer to 25%, 25%. Like that, there may not be a strictly privileged version because, they are not bought in on any particular system. You feel me? So yes, the sun matters because they do some agriculture, and the moon matters because they do some husbandry, right? And the earth matters because obviously they're very, very geographically centered, so to speak, right? Like you're not doing large empires, right? You're mostly island by island, right? So the earth signals
well, I
are
mean,
very
yeah,
important.
I mean, you'd have some kingdoms that could span some islands, but it wouldn't, yeah, but it wasn't like
Yeah.
it wasn't transnational type of. I mean,
Right, because you get a lot of folks like, this is our Japanese are a great example that are in our zeitgeist or in our cultural consciousness. Is Mount Fuji is a really big deal, and for the entire West, this is a little tiny bit weird. Like we've got the notion of Jerusalem, right? We got the notion of the oracles at Delphi, right? But like in the West, like unless again you're pagan, like specific landmarks are just not as important. It's seen as kind of woo to even talk about stuff like ley lines or like to care about Stonehenge, blah blah, right? So anyway, point being is that so I guess what I would predict with Polynesians is they're probably a blend of all four systems, with the stars playing way more heavily for them than for many other people, because while they're not nearly as bought in on the sun, moon, and earth as many of the other cultures we're talking about, right? They are also needing to navigate precisely from one spot to another, hence they use the stars. So unlike the
right.
Vikings, where you just kind of wander over that way, you hit France, hey, look, there's a monastery, let's go rape and pillage that guy, you know what I mean? Like um the targets are real big with the Vikings. You can afford to get like large swathy swaths, whereas the Arabs is very important that if you're setting out from this point, boy howdy, you better end up at another point, because otherwise you're gonna starve and burn to death, man. You know
True.
what
No,
I
that's a good
mean?
point. That is a good point. I'm thinking already. I mean, there's images of Lawrence of Arabia going through my head right now with that. Yeah, with the
Yep.
He was nothing. The well was everything. Yeah, exactly. Or the well is everything. Yeah, he was nothing.
think
Yeah,
about think about like a Dune situation, right? Like, right,
yeah,
I guess to kind of put a fine point on it, right? Earth people are localist, and precision doesn't matter, right? Sun and moon people, precision matters, and they may or may not be localist, right? But they're probably more like empire based. See, and this is where the thing is, right? Like the Jewish folks, right? Um, they are moving around, they're nomadic, but they're kind of like very local nomadic, you know what I mean? They're not like wandering very far away, right? Like the Arabs are the great contrast here, because a lot of the Arabian Peninsula Arabs in particular, yes, they're sedentary Arabic people, but like in that culture there's a huge culture of like trading and like wandering around and going from place to place. This is just not a thing. Like there are several stories where the big deal story in the Jewish canon is people moved, and this is
right.
like, oh my God, people moved. Don't you know that the Sumerians, who are like literally like half a day's walk north of us, are like, evil people you would never want to talk to? Like, you know what I mean? You look at these things, like, dude, this is even more pedantic than like London borough inter stuff. You know what I mean? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, what do you mean the Sumerians are completely different than you? Like, get out of here. But
Yeah.
that's a Sun people thing, right? Like, it's not
Well,
an
that
Earth.
would be a moon people thing, right?
No, so my statement of like, what do you mean, like one dude's mountain versus another dude's mountain? That's just stupid. Like, you should just care about like the mythological death and resurrection of Christ. That's like a sun person waving away
Right.
of the earth people, moon people kind of contentions, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And as
I
a
see what you
star
mean, I
per
guess.
and
Yeah.
as a star person, I'm much more likely to think purely metaphoretically about it. It's like, hey, from a cosmic perspective, what does it cosmically mean that Christ died and rose for us? Like, because for me personally, and this is just a point of my faith, I think it's important and relevant that Christians consider and think about, the historicity of Jesus. It's a very important part of Christianity, obviously, right? I'm not going to, deny that. But for me, it's almost not even relevant if he literally died and rose, right? Which obviously is heretical. I'm not saying people should, believe in that. What I'm saying, though, is that the death and resurrection is important because of its spiritual, cosmic importance, not because like a physical body died somewhere, right? Like getting hung
Oh,
up.
my brother in Christ, we're gonna fix you on this. You're not
But
fully embodied. Actually, you're weirdly you're Gnostic adjacent. We gotta help you. We gotta get you fully embodied.
well, no. So the point being is that like it is, again, it is important because, yeah, like from a Gnostic perspective, right? Like the gosh, okay. So I'll say it like this: the sacraments, right, are a visible sign of the invisible grace, right? It is
Right.
important that you actually eat the bread, right? Like you
Correct.
can't just have like, oh, I pretended to eat the bread, or I pretended to get sprinkled, right, in my heart.
Right.
Like, but what's the real work being done there? The real work is the invisible grace working behind the scenes. And so there's many Christians that get kind of caught up on like the physical details. And so like a Shroud of Turin situation where it's like, dude, like, you know what I mean? Like there's all these details where I'm like, bro, that detail actually kind of doesn't matter. Maybe it matters from a prophecy perspective, but like let's focus on like what actually matters, which is Christ died for us and rose for us, right? And not in a Gnostic sense, because again, the Gnostic account is totally different too. By the way, they're almost totally magical, right? But like
Right.
to discount the fact that the magic is the real work being done. Anyway, there's some nuance there, is what I would say. But
Okay. No, that makes yeah.
yeah,
I guess I understand it better now. Yeah. You're
yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
Gnostic. I get it, but
No, no, no.
yeah.
But it's
Uh,
easy to construe. Like it's easy to like, Gnostics are fundamentally star people, by the way, right? Like
okay. Yeah.
yeah, they are like a version of star people that are like the dark version, right? But think about it, right? Like they are focused entirely on the heavens. They think that the Earth and the sun and the moon, they're all fake and terrible. So
Well, it's interesting. Maybe this is as a way of wrapping it up as
yeah,
much as we can. Although obviously it's
100%.
this is just an introduction to a much bigger kind of mind bending in the best of ways way of viewing cultures and religions. You are a star people,
Hmm.
but you worship alongside many sun people, and that
Yes,
maybe perhaps makes you are kind of you are one of them. You are a magus. You're a magi. You're one of the
correct,
magi, and you're
correct.
strange, but for all of your strangeness, and that's a compliment, by the way,
Mhm,
for all of your
mhm.
strangeness, we should always remember, and this might break your system a bit, but I'm going to do it. We
Yeah,
should
that's
always remember that the sun is also a kind of star. So
yes,
perhaps the
yes.
star people aren't as different from us as we like to think, or as maybe we would see on first glance. So
Yep, they are a tribalistic star people. It's peace in the feud, right? They are siding. They are ours. It's our star, our particular star. We're taking a position in the solar system, and this is why star people, right, oftentimes are a little bit uncomfortable by the sun people because they don't want to take a position. They want to take the global, universal view, and it's like, well, hold on, we have a star. It's right here, right? This is the star that affects us most, not the other stars. The other stars give us information and data and do affect us, but our star is the important one. This is why when the sun rises, it has the only place, not the center place, the only place in the sky. And that's actually an important thing to think on, right? Like Christ, you know, there are points in which like the moon is co-inhabited by the sun, right? But generally speaking, right, barring like an eclipse or whatever, the sun takes the only stage, not just center stage. It's the only thing on stage when it's risen. So I think about that.
amen. Good way to end it. And a very good. Thank you again for coming on. I know you're quite busy. A very good
Mhm.
epiphany episode. Everyone who's watching, you're probably getting this from a Twitter feed, I'm imagining. So I mean, that being said, if you would please like, comment, subscribe, or just even interact with it somehow. I don't know how much YouTube really that affects us. We're
Mhm.
not monetized, and we talk about naughty things sometimes, not really, but stuff that's definitely not always safe for work. So, I mean, like our previous episode, we talked about vampire rape for like an hour. So, I mean,
Oh yeah,
do with that what you will.
that's not advocate friendly.
We don't advocate vampire rape, but we did talk about it. Um,
Yes,
so
Lucky Martin I'm sure they get monetized. Like interesting.
yeah. But if people would like, comment, subscribe, I think I mean, even just as from a spiritual sign of, hey, we stand with you, that'd be great. New stuff coming down the pipeline. If I can tease some things, me, Caleb, and Bulge should be doing an autistic breakdown of Sicario as a follow-up to our No Country for Old Men episode. That should be coming, hopefully, Lord willing, soon. So if you like Sicario and new sheriff in town, and we might Sicario, that movie is maybe prophetic in some ways. Who knows? It's a very good movie regardless. We'll be looking at that border violence and what it means for America and its place in America, things like that. I got
Mhm.
some stuff planned with Bulge. We're going to be doing some Kierkegaard again. Elliott will be happy to hear about
Oh,
that.
very excited.
The goal is we're going to be looking at for Lent, looking at Kierkegaard's essay At the Side of a Grave, which is one of the most awesome things that he ever wrote, and is very metal in a way. So cool stuff coming down the pipeline. Like, comment, subscribe,
Hmm.
all the things, and also if I can put on one more plug, a mutual in a way a mutual friend of Elliott's and mine, Pause from Timeline Earth. He runs Scarlet Thread Society. There's the standard regular Scarlet Thread Society feed, and then there's also a select inner circle for those initiated. The initiation rights involve $10 a month to a Patreon to help Pause, because he puts a lot of time and effort into this kind of stuff. I have a monthly show there called The Enchanted Office Hours. This month for January, we are going to be looking at creation myths. So a new year, new world, new me. So if you're at all interested in anything that me or Elliott have talked about here, this very much continues on in an even more spurgy, strange, and bizarre way on the Patreon Discord in particular. So I'm going to throw out a little tagline for my friend Paz too. All right. With that being said, everyone have a great rest of your Epiphany season. Enjoy your Candlemas if you do Candlemas, and Lent's right around the corner. So be thinking about that. Memento mori. All
And,
right.
and keep your eyes on the skies.
Eyes on the skies. Indeed. Watch the skies. All right. Peace, everyone. See you until next time. I'll see you. Yeah.